The acrid smell of ash and charred timber still hung heavy in the autumn air as the stagecoach wheels crunched over blackened debris that had once been Main Street. Clara Whitmore pressed her gloved hand protectively over the gentle swell beneath. Her traveling dress, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared through the coach window at what should have been her new home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Instead of the bustling frontier town Theodore Mansfield had described in his carefully penned letters, Millbrook Valley stretched before her like a graveyard of dreamed skeletal remains of buildings reaching toward an iron-gray sky, their charred fingers grasping at nothing. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Murphy, whose kind eyes had grown increasingly troubled during their approach to town, finally broke the stunned silence. "Ma'am, I'm right sorry about this. The fire happened near 3 months back, took most everything with it. Lightning strike during the worst drought anyone could remember." His voice carried the weight of someone who had delivered too much bad news in his lifetime. "You sure this is where you meant to come?" Clara's throat felt dry as desert sand, but she managed to nod. Her entire life savings, all $43.16, had brought her this far from Hartford, Connecticut. There was no money for a return journey, and even if there had been, what waited for her back east was worse than these smoking ruins. At least here, among the ashes, she might find the fresh start that Theodore's letters had promised. She had gambled everything on those letters, on his assurances that Millbrook Valley needed strong women willing to build a life on the frontier, that her past wouldn't matter in a place where everyone was writing their future from scratch. The coach lurched to a stop beside what had once been a depot, but now stood as little more than a blackened platform with a few salvaged benches. Clara gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. Her movements careful and deliberate, despite the trembling in her hands. The baby due in just 4 months, according to Dr. Hammond's calculations, seemed to sense her anxiety, shifting restlessly beneath her heart. As Murphy helped her down from the coach, Clara caught sight of a cluster of canvas tents and hastily constructed lean-tos scattered across what had been the town square. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear the sounds of reconstruction hammers ringing against nails, the scrape of shovels against debris, voices calling out instructions and encouragement. Despite the devastation, life persisted here. People endured. "That there's the temporary camp," Murphy explained, following her gaze. "Most folks are living rough while they decide whether to rebuild or move on. Some families packed up and headed west to California or north to Canada after the fire. Others are determined to see Millbrook Valley rise again." He hefted her trunk from the coach with a grunt. "You got someone meeting you, miss?" "Mrs.," Clara corrected softly, though the title felt like a lie on her tongue. She had never been married, but the assumed respectability that came with the prefix seemed essential for survival in a place like this. "Mrs. Whitmore, and yes, I'm expected by Mr. Theodore Mansfield." Murphy's expression shifted subtly, and Clara caught something that might have been pity flickering across his weathered features. "Theo Mansfield, you say? Well now, that's—" He scratched his grizzled jaw uncertainly. "Ma'am, I hate to be the bearer of more unwelcome news, but Theo's circumstances have changed considerable since the fire." A chill that had nothing to do with the October wind crept up Clara's spine. "What do you mean? Has something happened to him?" "Oh, he's alive and well enough," Murphy assured her quickly. "It's just that, well, he took himself a wife about 6 weeks back. Young widow from Pine Ridge whose husband died in a mining accident. She had 3 little ones and nowhere to go, and Theo," he shrugged helplessly. "Sometimes folks make decisions based on immediate need rather than prior obligations." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her swaying on her feet. Married. Theodore Mansfield. who had courted her through months of correspondence, who had sent her money for the journey west, who had promised her a home and security for both herself and her unborn child, had married someone else. The irony was so bitter she could taste it. She had come west to escape the shame of bearing a child out of wedlock, only to find herself abandoned once again. Did he? Clara's voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Did he receive my letter? The one I sent last month explaining my condition? Murphy's expression grew even more uncomfortable. I couldn't say for certain, ma'am, but the mail's been irregular since the fire. Lot of letters got lost or delayed. He didn't sound convinced. By his own words, and Clara suspected that Theodore had indeed received her confession about the pregnancy and had chosen to find himself a more suitable bride rather than honor his commitment to her. Standing there beside the ruined depot with ash swirling around her skirts and her entire future crumbling like the charred buildings surrounding her, Clara felt the same desperate panic that had driven her from Connecticut in the first place. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a stubborn resilience that had carried her through her father's death, her mother's subsequent nervous collapse, and the devastating betrayal by James Hartford, the banker's son who had sworn he loved her right up until the moment she told him about the baby. Where might I find Mr. Mansfield? She asked, straightening her spine despite the tremor in her voice. I believe we have matters to discuss. Murphy looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. He's got himself set up in the trading post, that's his general store. One of the few buildings that got rebuilt proper already. He pointed toward a squat wooden structure near the center of the camp. But ma'am, if you'll pardon my saying so, might be wise to find yourself lodging first. Widow O'Sullivan runs the shelter in what's left of the Charred Oak Inn. She's good people, and she doesn't ask too many questions about folks' circumstances. Clara nodded gratefully. At least there was somewhere she might lay her head tonight. Though what would happen after that remained to be seen. She had no family to return to, no friends who would welcome her in her condition, and no means to support herself and a child alone. The sewing skills that had earned her pin money in Hartford would hardly provide a living wage on the frontier. Murphy shouldered her trunk and led her across the debris-strewn square toward a partially standing two-story building that leaned precariously to one side, but still boasted an intact roof and walls. A hand-painted sign reading Charred Oak Shelter hung beside the door, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from within, surprisingly cheerful given the circumstances. Inside the shelter's main parlor was small but tidy, transformed into a sleeping area with bedrolls and makeshift bunks lining the walls. From what Clara assumed was the kitchen, a large woman with gray hair and flour-dusted hands appeared, wiping her palms on a sturdy apron. Her lined face hinted at a hard life, but her bright blue eyes radiated warmth. Another traveler, Murphy? She asked, her Irish lilt softened by years of hardship. Well then, welcome. I'm Beatrice O'Sullivan B. to everyone. And? You are? Clara Whitmore, Clara said, offering her hand. I came to Millbrook Valley to marry Mr. Theodore Mansfield. But I've learned things have changed. B's face shifted immediately, understanding mixed with anger. So you're the young lady from back east. We heard Theo was expecting someone, though he forgot that real fast once that widow Peterson showed up with her children. She shook her head. Some men just don't have an ounce of honor. The blunt confirmation of Theodore's betrayal hurt, but B's obvious disapproval gave Clara a sliver of comfort. Someone understood what she'd been through. I have nowhere else to go, Clara admitted softly, her hand resting on her abdomen, and I'm expecting. I had hoped that wouldn't matter to Mr. Mansfield, but maybe I was being foolish. B followed Clara's hand with her eyes, and her expression grew fierce with protectiveness. Well now, that explains a lot, doesn't it? He's a coward, plain and simple, but don't you worry, we'll make space for you. We need every willing hand to help rebuild this town, and a child is always a blessing, no matter the circumstances. The kindness in Bee's voice nearly brought Clara to tears. For months, she'd endured shame and judgment, first from her hometown, then from herself. Hearing someone call her child a blessing felt like the first bit of light in a very long time. "I can work," Clara said quickly. "I'm good with a needle. I'll pull my weight. I'm not here to be a burden." Bee laughed, the sound full and genuine. "No such thing as charity here, love. Just neighbors helping neighbors. We'll put your skills to good use soon enough. But first, let's get you fed and settled. Growing a baby takes strength." Murphy left to ask around for work that might fit Clara's skills. Meanwhile, Bee led her through the shelter, introducing her to the others. Mr. Henley, the former barber, now cutting hair for meals. Young Sarah Connor, who had lost her family's farm and now helped Bee cook. And the Peterson children, 3 of them, recently arrived with their mother before her quick marriage to Theodore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Seeing the children tugged at Clara's heart. In 4 months, she too would have a child, and no partner to rely on. The reality weighed heavy, but she pushed through. She hadn't come all this way to fall apart now. Finding purpose that evening, sitting on a bedroll with a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Clara found herself in conversation with Dr. Louisa Hartwell, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s. The town's physician, Louisa had trained back east but came west in search of independence and opportunity. "Bee tells me so," she said. "We badly need someone who can handle delicate stitching. Not just clothing, we're out of bandages, surgical thread, and all sorts of medical supplies. The fire wiped out most of our stock, and deliveries from the east are unpredictable." Clara's heart lifted at the thought of being useful. "I've done fine sewing since I was a child. My mother always said a needle could get you through anything." "She sounds like a wise woman," Louisa replied. "If you're willing, I'd appreciate your help. The pay's modest mostly. Credit and good faith, but it's steady, and you'd learn some valuable skills." Clara agreed at once, deeply grateful. Contributing something meaningful gave her a sense of purpose, and even the faintest sense of belonging, something she hadn't felt since leaving Hartford. An unexpected introduction. Later that night, just before 10, the front door opened. A tall man stepped inside, silhouetted by the windblown night. Clara glanced up from the shirt she was mending for one of the Peterson children and froze. The man was broad-shouldered and confident in his movements. He removed his hat with calm precision. His dark hair was streaked with early gray at the temples, and his face bore the marks of someone who had carried heavy burdens. "Evening, Bee," he said, his voice gravelly, as if damaged by smoke. "Just checking that everything's secure. Wind's picking up, and I want to make sure the heat's working." "Jamie Brennan, you're a gift," Bee said warmly. "Come in and meet our newest guest. Clara, this is Captain James Brennan, our fire chief. Jamie, meet Clara Whitmore. She's come all the way from Connecticut." Jamie looked at Clara, and she saw it instantly. The sorrow etched deep in his eyes, the kind that didn't fade with time. But when he smiled, it softened his entire face, revealing hints of the man he used to be. "Welcome to Millbrook Valley, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, stepping forward and shaking her hand. His grip was steady, strong, but kind. It offered something Clara hadn't felt in a long time: reassurance. "I'm sorry your arrival coincided with such difficult circumstances. The fire changed everything for all of us." "So I've learned," Clara replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the strange flutter in her chest. There was something about Captain Brennan's presence that seemed to calm the constant anxiety that had plagued her for months. "I understand you've lost a great deal yourself." A shadow passed over his features, and for a moment, the grief she had glimpsed in his eyes became almost overwhelming. "We all lost something that night," he said quietly. "But we're still here, and that means we have the chance to build something better from what remains." Dr. Hartwell spoke up from across the room. "Janie, you should know that Mrs. Whitmore has offered to help with medical supply preparation. She has excellent needlework skills." "That's generous of you," Captain Brennan said, his attention returning to Clara. "We can use all the help we can get. The road to recovery is going to be long for all of us." There was something in his tone, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, that suggested he was speaking from deeply personal experience. Clara found herself wanting to know more about this man who carried such obvious pain, yet still took time to check on the welfare of others in the middle of the night. As Captain Brennan prepared to leave, making his rounds to ensure the shelter's safety, he paused beside Clara's bedroll. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you don't mind my asking, what brought you to Millbrook Valley? It's a long journey from Connecticut, especially in your—" He gestured delicately toward her obvious condition. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze directly. She had discovered that honesty, while often painful, was generally the most efficient path through difficult conversations. "I came to marry Mr. Mansfield, but I understand he's found himself another bride. I'm afraid I'm rather stranded at the moment." Captain Brennan's expression darkened with what looked like anger, though Clara sensed it wasn't directed at her. "Theo Mansfield is a fool," he said bluntly, then immediately looked embarrassed by his outburst. "Forgive me, that was inappropriate. But abandoning someone who's traveled so far on good faith, it speaks poorly of his character." The simple validation of her situation, the acknowledgement that she had been wronged rather than being somehow at fault, nearly undid Clara's careful composure. For months, she had been made to feel that her pregnancy was a shameful burden, that any man who might accept her condition would be doing her an enormous favor. To have this stranger express indignation on her behalf was unexpectedly moving. "Thank you for saying that," she managed, her voice slightly thick with unshed tears. "I've begun to wonder if perhaps I expected too much." "You expected honesty and honor from someone who made you promises," Captain Brennan replied firmly. "Those aren't unreasonable expectations, Mrs. Whitmore. They're the foundation of any decent relationship." After he left to complete his rounds, Clara lay on her narrow bedroll staring at the ceiling and thinking about his words. She had spent so much time blaming herself for her circumstances, for trusting James Hartford, for believing Theodore's letters, for thinking she could somehow escape the consequences of her choices by fleeing west. But perhaps Captain Brennan was right. Perhaps she wasn't asking too much and wanting basic honesty and respect. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain air that made everything seem possible again. Clara woke early and helped Bea prepare breakfast for the shelter residents, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of domestic work. When Dr. Hartwell arrived to escort her to the temporary medical clinic, Clara felt ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. The clinic occupied a corner of the rebuilt church, its medical supplies arranged on makeshift tables and shelves. Dr. Hartwell showed Clara how to prepare bandages from torn sheets, how to thread surgical needles with the finest silk available, and how to create the small, precise stitches that could mean the difference between healing and infection. "You have excellent hands," Dr. Hartwell observed as Clara demonstrated her technique, steady and sure. "Have you ever considered studying medicine formally?" Clara nearly dropped the needle she was threading. "Women can do that?" "Not easily, and not everywhere," Dr. Hartwell admitted. "But it's becoming more possible, especially in places like this where necessity outweighs convention. I trained at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania before coming west. It was difficult, but it was worth every challenge." The idea of becoming a doctor seemed impossibly ambitious for someone in Clara's circumstances, but the seed of possibility took root in her mind. She had always been drawn to healing, had tended her father during his final illness, and had helped her mother through various ailments. Perhaps there was a future for her here that extended beyond simple survival. As they worked together throughout the morning, Dr. Hartwell shared stories of her medical training and her hopes for establishing a proper hospital in Millbrook Valley once the town was rebuilt. Clara found herself caught up in the physician's vision of a community where healing and hope could flourish side by side. It was nearly noon when the clinic door opened and Theodore Mansfield stepped inside. Clara's hands stilled on the bandage. She was rolling as she took in the appearance of the man whose letters had shaped her dreams for so many months. He was shorter than she had imagined, with thinning brown hair and the soft build of someone unaccustomed to physical labor. His clothes were clean and well-pressed, marking him as one of the few in town who had managed to maintain middle-class respectability despite the fire. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "I heard you'd found yourself an assistant. I trust she's proving useful?" His gaze flickered to Clara with polite disinterest, no recognition flickering in his pale blue eyes. The complete absence of acknowledgement hit her like a slap across the face. This was the man who had courted her through dozens of letters, who had claimed to long for her arrival, who had sent her money for the journey west. And he looked at her as though she were a complete stranger. "Mr. Mansfield, Doctor," Hartwell said carefully, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Clara Whitmore. She's recently arrived from Connecticut." The name finally registered, and Theodore's expression shifted from polite indifference to obvious discomfort. A flush crept up his neck as he seemed to struggle with how to handle the situation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally, his voice strained, "this is unexpected. I thought perhaps, given the circumstances, that you would have reconsidered your journey west." Clara set down the bandage she had been rolling and faced him directly. Months of uncertainty and shame had prepared her for this moment, but she still felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she spoke. "I received no communication suggesting I should reconsider," she said quietly. "Your last letter, dated August 15th, expressed eagerness for my arrival and assured me that my circumstances would not affect your commitment to our arrangement." Theodore's flush deepened, and he glanced around the clinic as though hoping for rescue from the uncomfortable conversation. "Yes, well, situations change, Mrs. Whitmore. Surely you understand that practical considerations must sometimes take precedence over earlier communications." Dr. Hartwell was watching the exchange with growing understanding and obvious disapproval. Clara could feel the physician's silent support, which gave her courage to press forward. "I understand that you married Mrs. Peterson 6 weeks ago," Clara continued. "I assume this occurred after you received my letter explaining my condition?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Theodore's discomfort was now clearly visible to everyone in the clinic. He tugged at his collar and avoided meeting Clara's steady gaze. "Mrs. Peterson was in desperate need," he said defensively. 3 children and no means of support. It was the Christian thing to do. "Of course," Clara replied evenly. "And breaking faith with someone who had traveled 1,000 miles based on your promises, what would you call that?" The directness of her challenge seemed to startle Theodore, who clearly hadn't expected the quiet woman from his correspondence to confront him so boldly. His face cycled through several shades of red before settling on an expression of affronted dignity. "I hardly think someone in your condition has the right to lecture me about Christian duty," he said, his voice carrying a nasty edge. "Perhaps, if you had been more forthcoming about your circumstances from the beginning, this unfortunate misunderstanding could have been avoided." The cruel words hung in the air between them, and Clara felt something inside her chest crack open like ice breaking in spring. But rather than the devastating shame she had expected, what flooded through her was a kind of clarity she hadn't experienced in months. This man, this petty, cruel, small-minded man, had never been worthy of her sacrifice or her trust. "I see," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Thank you for making your position so clear, Mr. Mansfield. I'm grateful to understand exactly what kind of man I've had such a narrow escape from marrying. Theodore's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, clearly not expecting such a response. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, her professional demeanor barely containing her obvious anger. Mr. Mansfield, I believe your business here is concluded, she said coldly. Mrs. Whitmore has work to complete, and I'm sure your wife is expecting you home. The dismissal was unmistakable, and Theodore seemed to realize he had lost whatever moral high ground he might have claimed. He straightened his jacket with wounded dignity and headed toward the door, but paused to deliver one final blow. I hope you understand, Mrs. Whitmore, that your presence in Millbrook Valley is somewhat awkward. Perhaps it would be better for everyone concerned if you considered relocating to a community where your circumstances might be less conspicuous. The suggestion that she leave town, that her mere presence was somehow inappropriate, hit Clara harder than any of his previous cruelties. But before she could formulate a response, another voice cut through the tension. I think that's quite enough, Mansfield. Captain Brennan stood in the clinic doorway, his tall frame filling the space and his gray eyes fixed on Theodore with unmistakable anger. Clara hadn't heard him approach, but his presence immediately shifted the entire dynamic. In the room. This conversation doesn't concern you, Brennan, Theodore said, though his voice lacked conviction. When someone is being harassed in my town, it concerns me very much, Captain Brennan replied, stepping fully into the clinic. Mrs. Whitmore is a resident of Millbrook Valley now, with the same rights and protections as anyone else here. Theodore seemed to shrink under the fire chief's steady gaze. I was simply trying to help her understand. You were trying to drive away someone whose only crime was trusting your word. Captain Brennan interrupted. I suggest you return to your store, Mansfield, and remember that a man's reputation is built on how he treats people who can't defend themselves. The warning was quiet but unmistakable, and Theodore seemed to realize he had pushed things as far as he dared. He muttered something about being misunderstood and hurried from the clinic, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Clara stood, frozen beside the medical supplies table, overwhelmed by the rapid succession of emotions that had crashed over her in the past few minutes. Relief, anger, humiliation, and something else, a gratitude so profound it threatened to bring tears to her eyes. Are you all right? Captain Brennan asked gently, his anger immediately softening into concern as he approached her. I think so, Clara managed, though her hands were shaken as she reached for the bandage she had abandoned. Thank you for what you said. You didn't have to intervene. Yes, I did, he replied firmly. What Mansfield did to you was dishonorable, and allowing him to compound that by driving you out of town would make the rest of us complicit in his cowardice. Dr. Hartwell spoke up from across the clinic. Jamie's right, Clara. You belong here now, regardless of what Theodore Mansfield thinks. This town needs people with your skills and your character. The simple acceptance, the matter-of-fact assertion that she belonged somewhere was almost more than Clara could process. For so long, she had felt like an outsider everywhere she went, marked by shame and desperate for any scrap of acceptance. To have these people defend her right to exist in their community felt like a miracle she hadn't dared to hope for. I don't want to cause trouble, she said quietly. Captain Brennan moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his gray eyes and the deep lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. Mrs. Whitmore, the only trouble in this situation was caused by a man who made promises he had no intention of keeping. Your presence here isn't a problem to be solved, it's an addition to be welcomed. The sincerity in his voice made Clara's throat tight with emotion. She had been prepared for judgment, for the kind of conditional acceptance that depended on her hiding her circumstances and apologizing for her existence. Instead, she had found people willing to defend her right to dignity and belonging. As Captain Brennan prepared to leave, Continuing his daily rounds through the rebuilding community, he paused beside Clara one more time. "Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you'll consider staying in Millbrook Valley permanently. We're building something new here, something better than what was lost in the fire. And that kind of rebuilding requires people with courage, people willing to start over despite difficult circumstances." His gaze held hers steadily. "People exactly like you." After he left, Clara returned to her work with renewed focus, but her mind kept circling back to his words. For the first time since leaving Hartford, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. Perhaps here, among the ashes of what had been, she could help build something worthy of the child growing beneath her heart. The afternoon brought a steady stream of patients to the clinic, and Clara found herself assisting Dr. Hartwell with treatments that ranged from minor burns to respiratory ailments caused by lingering smoke damage. Each task completed successfully added to her growing confidence, and she began to see how her skills might develop into something that could support both herself and her baby. As evening approached and the day's work wound down, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope she had carried on the journey west, but something sturdier, something that could weather disappointment and grow stronger through adversity. She was beginning to understand that sometimes the very thing that seemed like the end of everything could actually be the beginning of something better. Theodore Mansfield's betrayal had freed her from a future that would have been built on lies and conditional acceptance. His cruelty had revealed the true character of the people around her, and showed her that she was capable of standing up for herself with dignity intact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. The practical concerns of housing, work, and preparing for a baby remained to be solved. But tonight, as she helped Bea prepare dinner for the shelter residents and listened to Captain Brennan's deep voice as he checked the building's safety one more time, Clara allowed herself to believe that she had found something precious among the ruins of Millbrook Valley. She had found a place where she could belong exactly as she was. The weeks that followed Theodore's cruel dismissal settled into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its sense of purpose. Each morning she rose before dawn to help Bea prepare breakfast for the shelter residents, her movements careful but determined as her pregnancy progressed. The work felt familiar and grounding, reminding her of the years she had managed her family's household after her mother's health declined. By 7 o'clock, she would make her way to the clinic where Dr. Hartwell waited with the day's medical preparations. Under the physician's patient tutelage, Clara's skills expanded rapidly beyond simple needlework. She learned to mix tinctures from the medicinal herbs that grew wild in the surrounding mountains, to recognize the signs of infection and fever, and to assist with minor surgical procedures that Dr. Hartwell performed in the clinic's cramped quarters. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying in ways that surprised her. Each bandage properly prepared, each successful treatment, felt like a small victory against the chaos that had consumed so much of her recent life. Dr. Hartwell proved to be not only an excellent teacher, but an unexpectedly warm friend. During their long hours working side by side, the reserved physician gradually revealed her own story of struggle and determination. She had fought for every opportunity, faced down professors who believed women had no place in medicine, and endured years of professional isolation before finding acceptance in the desperate circumstances of frontier life. The fire was terrible, Dr. Hartwell confided one afternoon as they organized the clinic's meager pharmaceutical supplies. So many lives lost, so much destruction. But it also created opportunities that would never have existed in the old world. Here, competence matters more than convention. A woman doctor isn't an oddity when she's the only physician for 100 miles. Clara found herself drawn to this vision of possibility emerging from disaster. Do you really think I could learn enough to be truly useful? Not just as an assistant, but as someone capable of independent practice. Dr. Hartwell paused in her sorting and studied Clara with the same intensity she brought to examining patients. You have excellent instincts, steady hands, and the kind of calm presence that patients trust. More importantly, you're not afraid of hard work or difficult decisions. Those qualities matter more than formal education in a place like this. The encouragement kindled something in Clara that had been dormant since her father's death years. Earlier, she began borrowing Dr. Hartwell's medical texts, studying by lamplight in the shelter's common room while the other residents slept. The Latin terminology was challenging, but she found herself fascinated by the intricate workings of the human body and the elegant logic of proper treatment protocols. Captain Brennan became a regular presence at both the shelter and the clinic. During these weeks, though his visits always carried the official purpose of checking on community safety and health, Clara noticed that he seemed to find numerous reasons to inspect the clinic's heating system, test the structural integrity of the shelter's repairs, and ensure that the medical supplies were properly stored against the increasingly cold October nights. His presence had an effect on her that Clara tried not to examine too closely. When he entered a room, she found herself acutely aware of his movements, the sound of his voice as he spoke with other residents, the careful way he handled tools and equipment that suggested both strength and precision. There was something about his quiet competence that reminded her of her father at his best, before illness had weakened him. But there was also something uniquely compelling about Captain Brennan himself, a combination of authority and gentleness that made her feel both protected and respected. Their conversations began tentatively, usually focused on practical matters related to the clinic or shelter operations. But gradually, they evolved into something deeper. Captain Brennan possessed an educated mind that had clearly been shaped by extensive reading, and he spoke knowledgeably about subjects ranging from engineering to literature. Clara discovered that he had attended university back east before coming west, though he never elaborated on what had driven him to leave behind what must have been a comfortable life. "You're doing important work here," he told her one evening, as she finished organizing the day's medical supplies. The clinic was empty except for the two of them, Dr. Hartwell having departed to tend to a difficult birth at one of the outlying homesteads. "Dr. Hartwell tells me you're learning faster than any assistant she's ever trained." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise, though she tried to maintain appropriate modesty. "I enjoy the work. It feels meaningful in ways that my previous occupations never did." "What did you do before coming west, Captain?" Brennan asked, settling into a chair beside the table where she worked. The question was casual, but Clara sensed genuine interest behind it. She hesitated, unsure how much of her story to reveal. The truth was complicated and potentially damaging to the fragile acceptance she had found in Millbrook Valley. But something about Captain Brennan's steady presence encouraged honesty. "I kept house for my mother after my father died," she said finally. "And I did piecework sewing for ladies in town who needed alterations or repairs. It wasn't particularly fulfilling, but it provided a modest income." She paused, then added more quietly, until circumstances made it impossible to continue. Captain Brennan seemed to understand the delicate way she was referring to her pregnancy without stating it directly. His expression remained carefully neutral, free of the judgment she had learned to expect when the subject arose. "Sometimes circumstances that seem like disasters at the time turn out to be redirections towards something better," he said thoughtfully. "I found that life has a way of closing doors we think we want to walk through in order to open ones we never knew existed." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with such redirections, and Clara found herself curious about what doors had closed and opened in his own life. But before she could formulate a tactful way to inquire, the clinic door opened and young Tommy Pike burst in, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Captain Brennan, sir." The 16-year-old gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You're needed at the Peterson place right away. There's been an accident." Captain Brennan was on his feet immediately, his relaxed demeanor shifting into focused urgency. What kind of accident, Tommy? Is anyone seriously hurt? It's Mr. Peterson, sir. He was working on the roof repairs when a beam gave way. Mrs. Peterson thinks his leg might be broken, and he's bleeding something fierce. She sent me to fetch you and Dr. Hartwell." Clara stood as well, her mind already cataloging the medical supplies that might be needed for such an injury. Dr. Hartwell is at the Henderson homestead for a birth. She won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest. Captain Brennan's gaze met hers, and she could see him weighing options rapidly. "How confident are you in treating a broken leg and severe lacerations?" The question was sobering in its implications. This would be far beyond anything she had attempted independently, requiring decisions that could mean the difference between successful healing and permanent disability. But Clara thought of the knowledge she had been absorbing, the techniques Dr. Hartwell had demonstrated, and the trust that was being placed in her capabilities. "I can do it," she said with more confidence than she felt. "But I'll need help. And we'll need to bring some of the clinic supplies with us." Captain Brennan nodded decisively. "Tommy, harness the emergency wagon and load it with whatever Mrs. Whitmore tells you we need. Clara, gather your supplies quickly. Every minute counts with injuries like this." The next hour passed in a blur of urgent activity. Clara found herself drawing on reserves of knowledge and composure she hadn't known. She possessed as they raced through the darkening evening toward the Peterson homestead. The wagon jolted over rough terrain, and she held tightly to the medical kit she had hastily assembled, her mind running through treatment protocols and potential complications. The Peterson house, one of the first to be rebuilt after the fire, sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley. Even from a distance, they could hear the crying of children and the distressed voices of adults dealing with crisis. Mrs. Peterson met them at the door, her face streaked with tears and her hands stained with blood from trying to tend her husband's wounds. "Oh, thank goodness you've come," she sobbed, leading them quickly to the back room where Theodore lay on a makeshift bed, his right leg twisted at an unnatural angle and a deep gash across his thigh bleeding steadily despite the crude bandaging. His wife had attempted. Clara's first instinct was to recoil from the severity of the injuries, but her training overrode personal reaction. She moved immediately to Theodore's side, her hands steady as she began examining the damage. The leg was definitely broken, with what appeared to be a compound fracture just below the knee. The laceration was deep but relatively clean, suggesting it could be sutured successfully if infection was prevented. "Mr. Mansfield," she said quietly, noting that Theodore was conscious but clearly in severe pain, "I'm going to help you, but I need you to try to remain still while I work." Theodore's eyes focused on her with difficulty, confusion and pain clouding his features. "Clara, why are you here?" "Dr. Hartwell is away, and I've been trained to assist with medical emergencies," Clara replied calmly, already beginning to clean and assess the wounds. "Captain Brennan is here as well. We're going to take good care of you." Whatever Theodore might have thought about receiving medical treatment from the woman he had so cruelly dismissed was lost in the urgency of his condition. Clara worked with methodical precision, cleaning the laceration and preparing to suture it, while Captain Brennan helped stabilize the broken leg for proper splinting. "The bleeding is slowing," she reported, more to herself than to the anxious watchers. "The cut missed the major vessels, thank goodness. But this bone needs to be set properly or he'll walk with a permanent limp." Captain Brennan moved to assist. Without being asked, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped manipulate the broken bone back into proper alignment. Theodore cried out at the pain, but Clara could see that the captain's positioning was exactly right. "Hold it steady," she instructed, beginning the delicate process of splinting the leg with boards and bandages. "We need to immobilize it completely until Dr. Hartwell can examine it properly." As she worked, Clara found herself entering a state of focused calm that she had never experienced before. The technical challenges of the treatment, the need for precise decision-making, The life-changing consequences of each choice she made, all combined to create a sense of purpose and competence that felt entirely natural. This was what she was meant to do, she realized. This was the work that could give meaning to all the pain and displacement she had endured. It took nearly 2 hours to complete the treatment, suturing the laceration with tiny, careful stitches and constructing a splint that would keep the broken bone properly aligned during healing. Throughout the process, Captain Brennan assisted with quiet efficiency, anticipating her needs and providing steady support that allowed her to focus entirely on the medical requirements. When she finally sat back to assess her work, Clara felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with the knowledge that she had probably saved Theodore from months of agony and permanent disability. The man who had treated her so cruelly would walk normally again because of skills she had never known she possessed. Mrs. Peterson hovered anxiously as Clara explained the aftercare requirements, the signs of infection to watch for, and the importance of keeping the patient immobilized for at least 6 weeks. Dr. Hartwell will want to examine him when she returns, Clara concluded, but the immediate danger has passed. I don't know how to thank you, Mrs. Peterson whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. When I saw all that blood, I was so frightened. You did exactly the right thing by sending for help quickly, Clara assured her. That made all the difference. As they prepared to leave, Theodore managed to catch Clara's hand with his uninjured one. His face was pale with pain and medication, but his eyes were clearer than they had been earlier. Clara, he said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. What I said to you at the clinic, it was unforgivable. You saved my leg tonight, maybe my life after the way I treated you. He swallowed hard. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I recognize what kind of person you truly are. Clara looked down at the man who had shaped so many of her recent struggles, and found that the anger and hurt she had carried were beginning to transform into something closer to pity. Theodore Mansfield was not evil, she realized, just weak, and frightened and too concerned with social appearances to recognize genuine worth when he encountered it. Rest and heal, Mr. Mansfield, she said gently. Your family needs you healthy. The ride back to town passed in contemplative silence, both Clara and Captain Brennan absorbed in processing the evening's events. The emergency had revealed capabilities in both of them that might never have emerged under ordinary circumstances. Clara had discovered that she could function under pressure with professional competence, while Captain Brennan had proven to be an ideal medical assistant despite having no formal training. You were extraordinary tonight, Captain Brennan said finally as they approached the shelter. I've seen trained physicians who couldn't have handled that situation with half your skill and composure. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise, though she tried to maintain appropriate humility. I couldn't have managed it without your help. You seemed to know exactly what I needed before I asked for it. We work well together, he agreed, and something in his tone made Clara glance at him more closely. There was an intensity in his expression that had nothing to do with medical emergencies, a focus that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were in the darkness of the wagon. Clara, he began, then stopped himself, seeming to struggle with something internal. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you'll forgive the informality, but tonight made me realize something I've been trying to ignore. Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she tried to keep her expression calm. What's that, Captain Brennan? That I've come to care for you a great deal more than is probably appropriate, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I know your circumstances are complicated, and I know I have no right to speak of such things when you're in a vulnerable position. But watching you tonight, seeing your strength and competence and compassion, I couldn't let another day pass without you knowing that I hold you in the highest regard. The careful formality of his words couldn't disguise the emotion behind them, and Clara felt something inside her chest flutter with possibilities she had been afraid to acknowledge. Captain Brennan was everything that Theodore Mansfield was not. Honorable, competent, genuinely kind, and strong enough to defend those who needed protection. "Your regard means more to me than you could know," she replied softly. "These past weeks, your friendship has been one of the few bright spots in a very difficult time." "Friendship," he repeated, and there was something wistful in his tone. "Yes, I hope we can always be friends, regardless of what else might develop between us." The implication hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and uncertainty. Clara found herself wanting to reach for his hand, to offer some gesture of encouragement for the feelings he was struggling to express. But the practical constraints of her situation held her back. She was pregnant with another man's child, dependent on the charity of the community, and in no position to offer anything resembling a normal courtship. "Captain Brennan," she began carefully, "I need you to understand that my circumstances are not likely to change in the foreseeable future. I'm going to have a baby in 3 months, and I have no resources beyond what I can earn through my own work. Any man who might consider a relationship with me would be taking on significant responsibilities that he didn't create. Do you think I haven't considered that?" he asked gently, finally turning to meet her gaze. "Clara, I'm not a young man looking for a convenient romance. I'm 32 years old, and I've learned to recognize genuine worth when I encounter it. A child is a blessing, regardless of the circumstances of its conception. And a woman of your character and capabilities would be an asset to any man fortunate enough to earn her affection." The simple acceptance in his voice, the matter-of-fact way he dismissed the concerns that had tormented her for months, nearly brought tears to Clara's eyes. She had become so accustomed to shame and judgment that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be valued simply for who she was. "You're very kind," she whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I'm not being kind," Captain Brennan replied firmly. "I'm being honest. And I'm hoping that in time, you might come to see yourself the way I see you, the way Dr. Hartwell sees you, the way everyone in this community sees you except for small-minded fools like Theodore Mansfield." They had reached the shelter, but neither made any immediate move to leave the wagon. The conversation felt unfinished, balanced on the edge of something that could change everything or nothing, depending on choices that neither was quite ready to make. "Would you?" Captain Brennan began hesitantly. "Would you allow me to call on you properly? Not as the fire chief checking on community safety, but as a man who would very much like to spend time in your company?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she considered the implications of accepting such an invitation. It would mean acknowledging that something was developing between them, something that could lead to expectations and commitments that might prove impossible to fulfill. But it would also mean embracing the possibility of happiness she had thought was lost forever. "I would like that very much," she heard herself say, and was rewarded by a smile that transformed Captain Brennan's entire face. "Tomorrow is Sunday," he said. "If the weather holds, perhaps you'd enjoy a walk after church services. I could show you some of the rebuilding projects we have planned for the spring." "That sounds lovely," Clara agreed, already looking forward to the opportunity to spend time with him away from the pressures of medical emergencies and community obligations. As Captain Brennan helped her down from the wagon and carried her medical kit to the shelter door, Clara felt something she had almost forgotten how to experience. Hope, not desperate and fragile as it had been when she arrived in Millbrook Valley, but steady and warm and grounded in the recognition of her own worth. Inside the shelter, Bea waited up to hear about the emergency call, her face lighting with pride as Clara described the successful treatment of Theodore's injuries. "Dr. Hartwell will be so pleased," the older woman said, bustling around to prepare. "Late-night tea. You've proven yourself tonight, dear one. The whole community will know by tomorrow that we have 2 fine physicians looking after our health." As Clara settled into her bedroll, exhausted but deeply satisfied by the evening's work, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed in just a few short weeks. She had arrived in Millbrook Valley as a desperate woman fleeing scandal and shame, dependent on the questionable charity of a man who had ultimately betrayed her trust. Now she was developing skills that could support herself and her child, earning respect through competence rather than begging for acceptance through submission. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that the child she carried was not the burden she had been taught to believe, but a source of strength and purpose. The baby had motivated her to take risks she might never have attempted for herself alone, had given her the courage to defend her right to dignity and belonging, and had attracted the kind of man who saw children as blessings rather than complications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. The practical concerns of establishing herself professionally, preparing for motherhood, and navigating the delicate beginning of a relationship with Captain Brennan would all require careful attention. But tonight, as she listened to the sounds of a community healing itself around her, Clara allowed herself to believe that she had found something she had never dared to hope for. She had found a place where she could build a life worthy of the child she would soon bring into the world, surrounded by people who valued her for her true worth rather than judging her for her circumstances. And perhaps most miraculously of all, she had found a man who looked at her and saw not a woman diminished by mistakes, but one strengthened by surviving them. The future stretched before her, no longer dark with shame and uncertainty, but bright with possibility and the promise of love that accepted rather than condemned. In the ashes of Millbrook Valley, Clara Whitmore was finally learning to stand tall. The morning of Clara's first official walk with Captain Brennan dawned crisp and brilliant, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made the rebuilt portions of Millbrook Valley gleam like jewels against the autumn landscape. Clara had spent extra time arranging her hair and selecting her best remaining dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes and accommodated her expanding figure with dignity rather than shame. Bea had watched these preparations with barely concealed delight, offering advice about walking routes and weather considerations, while clearly thrilled by this development in Clara's circumstances. That man has been looking for reasons to visit this shelter every day since you arrived, she confided as she helped Clara pin her hair into an elegant twist. I've seen him check our chimney for safety hazards at least 6 times this week alone. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the thought that Captain Brennan's frequent visits might have been motivated by more than professional duty. After so many months of feeling invisible or unwanted, the possibility that someone might actively seek her company was almost overwhelming in its sweetness. Church services were held in the rebuilt sanctuary, a modest structure that had risen from the ashes of the original building with contributions from every family in the valley. Pastor Fairfax delivered a sermon about renewal and second chances that seemed particularly appropriate to Clara's circumstances, though she suspected that might be her own interpretation rather than intentional targeting. When the service concluded, Captain Brennan appeared at her side with the natural ease of someone who belonged there. He offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and Clara was struck again by the combination of strength and gentleness that seemed to define his character. Other congregants nodded to them with varying degrees of approval and curiosity, but the open hostility she had feared was notably absent. I thought we might walk up toward the reservoir site, Captain Brennan suggested as they left the churchyard. The view from there shows the full scope of our rebuilding plans, and it's one of the few places in the valley that wasn't touched by the fire. The path he led her along wound gradually upward through stands of pine and aspen, their leaves a brilliant gold against the evergreen backdrop. Clara found the moderate exertion pleasant rather than taxing, her body still strong despite the pregnancy. Captain Brennan matched his pace to hers without making her feel rushed or fragile, another small courtesy that she appreciated deeply. Tell me about your plans for the town, Clara requested as they walked. Dr. Hartwell mentioned that you're involved in the reconstruction planning. Captain Brennan's face animated with enthusiasm as he described the vision that had emerged. from the ashes of the old Millbrook Valley. We have a chance to build something better than what we lost, he explained. Wider streets for fire safety, proper water systems, buildings designed to withstand both weather and emergency situations. The fire was a tragedy, but it's also given you was the opportunity to start fresh with everything we've learned. His passion for the project was evident in every word, and Clara found herself drawn into his vision of a community that would be stronger and safer than its predecessor. He spoke knowledgeably about engineering principles and construction techniques, revealing an education and experience that went far beyond what she had expected from a frontier fire chief. "You studied engineering before coming west," she observed. More statement than question. Captain Brennan nodded, a shadow crossing his features briefly. "At Columbia, back in New York, I had planned to work on large construction projects, bridges, and public buildings. But circumstances changed, and I found myself needing to start over somewhere new." There was pain in his voice that Clara recognized, from her own experience of having life plans disrupted by forces beyond control. She sensed that his story, like hers, involved loss and difficult choices that had ultimately led him to this remote valley. "What brought you to Millbrook Valley specifically?" she asked gently, hoping he would feel comfortable sharing more of his history. Captain Brennan was quiet for several moments, and Clara began to worry that she had pressed too deeply into private territory. But when he spoke again, his voice carried the careful control of someone who had learned to discuss painful subjects without being overwhelmed by them. "I came here 5 years ago with my wife Helen and our twin daughters," he said quietly. Helen had consumption, and the doctors recommended mountain air and a dry climate. "We thought the clean living and slower pace might help her recover." He paused, struggling with words that clearly still carried tremendous weight. "She did improve for a while. The girls thrived here, loved the freedom and the wilderness. We were happy, genuinely happy, for the first time in years." Clara felt her heart constrict with sympathy as she began to understand the source of the deep sadness she had glimpsed in his eyes. "They were lost in the fire?" "Helen and both girls," he confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were visiting the Hendersons' farm when the fire swept through the eastern valley. The wind changed direction so suddenly that they couldn't get back to the main road. I was leading the firefighting efforts in town, thinking my family was safe, because they were so far from the initial blaze." He stopped walking entirely, staring out at the valley below them with unseeing eyes. "I failed them completely. Failed as a husband, as a father, as the person who was supposed to protect them above all else." The raw anguish in his voice made Clara's throat tighten with unshed tears. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, offering the simple comfort of human contact to someone clearly drowning in grief and self-recrimination. "You couldn't have known the fire would spread so quickly," she said softly. "You were trying to save the entire community. That wasn't failure, Captain Brennan. That was impossible choices forced on you by circumstances beyond anyone's control." He turned to look at her then, his gray eyes reflecting a pain so profound that Clara ached. "In sympathy. Everyone tells me that. The rational part of my mind even believes it. But the part that loved them, that promised to keep them safe, that part knows I chose the town over my family when the crisis came." Clara recognized the familiar torture of self-blame, the way grief could twist every decision into evidence of personal failure. She had carried similar burdens about her father's death, about the choices that had led to her pregnancy, about every moment when she might have acted differently to change the course of events. Grief has a way of making us feel responsible for things that were never within our power, she said carefully. "I blamed myself for my father's death because I couldn't convince him to see a doctor sooner. I blamed myself for trusting the wrong man and ending up in circumstances that have caused nothing but hardship. But blaming ourselves doesn't honor the people we've lost, and it doesn't help us become the people they would want us to be." Captain Brennan studied her face with the intensity of someone discovering something unexpected and precious. How did you become so wise about such things? The same way you became wise about rebuilding after disasters, Clara replied with a sad smile. By surviving experiences I wouldn't wish on anyone else. They resumed walking, but something had shifted between them during the conversation. The careful formality of a first courtship call had given way to something deeper and more honest, a recognition of shared experience with loss and the determined choice to continue living despite it. The reservoir site, when they reached it, was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Captain Brennan explained how the new water system would provide both fire protection and reliable irrigation for the surrounding farms, his technical expertise evident in every detail he described. But Clara found herself more interested in watching his face as he spoke, noting how his enthusiasm for the project seemed to lift some of the weight he carried. "This is what keeps you going," she observed. "Building something that will protect other families from what happened to yours." "It helps," he acknowledged. "Though lately I've found other reasons to look toward the future with something approaching hope." The way he looked at her when he said this left no doubt about his meaning, and Clara felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. The possibility of love was intoxicating, but the practical complications of their situation remained daunting. "Captain Brennan," she began carefully, "I need you to understand that I can offer no guarantees about the future. In 2 months, I'll have a baby who will require all my attention and resources. I have no family to help, no inherited wealth to provide security. Any man who chooses to build a life with me would be taking on significant responsibilities." "James," he corrected gently. "If we're going to discuss building a life together, I think you should call me James." The simple request sent warmth flooding through Clara's chest. The transition from formal address to given names felt like crossing a threshold into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. "James," she repeated, testing the feel of his name on her tongue. "I need to know that you truly understand what you would be taking on." James moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his gray eyes and smell the clean scent of soap and mountain air that seemed to surround him. "Clara, I lost everything that mattered to me in that fire. For 2 years, I've been going through the motions of living while feeling dead inside. Then you arrived in our community, and for the first time since Helen and the girls died, I remembered what it felt like to care about someone else's welfare more than my own." His honesty took her breath away, both in its emotional intensity and in its clear-eyed acknowledgement of what he was feeling. This was not the desperate passion of youth or the convenient arrangement that Theodore had offered, but something deeper and more mature. "You don't see my pregnancy as a burden or complication?" she asked, needing to hear him address this directly. "I see it as a gift," James replied firmly. "A chance to be present for the beginning of a life instead of only witnessing endings. A reminder that hope and new beginnings are always possible, even after terrible loss." The tears that Clara had been holding back finally spilled over, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. For so many months, she had carried the weight of shame and judgment about her condition. To have someone speak of her unborn child as a gift, rather than a burden, felt like absolution she had never dared to hope for. James reached up gently to brush away her tears, his touch so tender that it made her heart ache with longing. "I don't want to pressure you into anything you're not ready for," he said softly. "But I want you to know that when I look at you, I see the possibility of a future I thought I'd lost forever. A family, a home, a reason to build something lasting rather than just surviving from day to day." Clara closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine what such a future might look like. A home filled with laughter and purpose, a man who valued her contributions and cherished her child, work that mattered and love that accepted rather than condemned. It seemed almost too wonderful to believe possible. "I'd like that too," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. More than I can express. James smiled then, the expression transforming his features and revealing glimpses of the man he must have been before grief marked him. Slowly, giving her ample opportunity to withdraw if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. The simple gesture was more moving than any passionate embrace could have been, conveying respect and affection and the promise of protection without demanding anything in return. Clara felt something inside her chest bloom. With warmth and possibility, a feeling she had almost forgotten how to experience. Their walk back to town passed in comfortable conversation about practical matters and shared dreams. James described his plans for building a proper house once the community infrastructure was complete, while Clara shared her growing interest in formal medical training and the possibility of establishing a real hospital in Millbrook Valley. Dr. Hartwell thinks I could be ready to take the examinations for medical certification within 2 years, Clara confided as they approached the shelter. It would mean studying intensively and probably traveling to Denver for testing. But the opportunities for women in medicine are expanding. I think that's exactly what you should do, James replied enthusiastically. You have natural talent and the kind of dedication that would make you an excellent physician. The community would be fortunate to have 2 skilled doctors, especially with the population growth we're expecting, as word spreads about our rebuilding success. His immediate support for her professional ambitions was yet another indication that this man was fundamentally different from others she had known. Theodore had wanted a conventional wife who would enhance his social standing. James seemed to want a partner who would challenge him and contribute to their shared community. As they reached the shelter's front steps, James paused and turned to face her directly. Clara, would you allow me to call on you again next Sunday? And perhaps during the week as well, if opportunities arise. I'd like that very much, Clara replied, meaning every word. There's something else I'd like to discuss with you when you feel ready for such conversations, James continued, his expression growing more serious. I know it's early in our acquaintance, and I don't want to presume anything about your feelings, but I find myself thinking about permanent arrangements, about building a life together that could provide security and happiness for both you and your child. The careful way he phrased the suggestion made it clear that he was speaking of marriage, though he was too much of a gentleman to propose directly during their first formal outing. Clara felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The possibility was everything she had hoped for, but the reality of making such a momentous decision remained daunting. I think such conversations might be premature, she said gently, but I'm not opposed to them in principle. I would want to be certain that any permanent arrangement was based on genuine affection and compatibility, not just practical convenience. Of course, James agreed immediately. I would never want you to feel obligated or pressured into anything. Whatever develops between us should be based on mutual respect and genuine caring. As Clara prepared to enter the shelter, she felt a sense of anticipation about the future that she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of love, of building a real family, of finding both personal happiness and professional fulfillment, seemed within reach for the first time since her world had collapsed in Hartford. Inside the shelter, Bea was waiting with barely contained curiosity about how the afternoon had progressed. Clara found herself sharing more details than she had initially intended, describing both James's tragic history and his hopeful vision for their potential future together. That man has been carrying a terrible burden, Bea observed thoughtfully. Losing a wife and children in such circumstances would break most people entirely. The fact that he's managed to keep functioning, to keep contributing to the community's welfare, speaks to tremendous strength of character. Do you think it's too soon for him to be considering another relationship? Clara asked, voicing a concern that had been nagging at her throughout their conversation. I wouldn't want to be a substitute for what he's lost, or a distraction from proper grieving. Bea considered the question seriously before responding. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, dear one. Some people need years to heal from such losses, while others find that new love helps them honor the past while embracing the future. The important thing is that both people involved are honest about their motivations and expectations. The older woman's wisdom helped ease some of Clara's anxieties, though she knew that navigating a relationship with someone carrying such profound loss would require sensitivity and patience. But James had been nothing but honest about his circumstances and feelings, and his obvious care for her welfare suggested that his interest was genuine rather than merely convenient. That evening, as Clara helped prepare dinner for the shelter residents, she found herself humming softly while she worked. The simple melody seemed to bubble up from a well of contentment she had almost forgotten existed, a reminder that joy was still possible even after profound disappointment and hardship. Dr. Hartwell arrived just as the meal was being served. Tired from her journey, but pleased to hear about the successful treatment of Theodore's injuries. "You handled that exactly as I would have," she told Clara with obvious pride. "Your instincts were sound, your technique was precise, and your instincts were sound. Your instincts were sound. Composure under pressure was exemplary. I couldn't be more pleased with your progress." The professional validation was deeply satisfying, but Clara found herself even more excited to share news of her developing relationship with James. Dr. Hartwell listened to the account of their afternoon walk with the same careful attention she brought to medical consultations. "Captain Brennan is one of the finest men I've ever known," the physician concluded. "His dedication to this community during his own time of grief has been extraordinary. If he's expressing interest in building a future with you, it's because he recognizes your true worth." As the evening wound down and the shelter residents prepared for bed, Clara stood at the window, looking out at the lights scattered across the valley. Each point of illumination represented a family working to rebuild their lives from the ashes of disaster, creating something new and hopeful from the fragments of what had been lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. Her pregnancy was advancing steadily, requiring increasing attention to practical preparations for the baby's arrival. Her medical training continued to expand, with Dr. Hartwell introducing more complex procedures and diagnostic techniques. And now, most wonderfully, there was the developing relationship with James to navigate, with all its promise and complexity. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Hartford, Clara felt genuinely optimistic about what lay ahead. She had found meaningful work, earned respect through competence, and discovered the possibility of love accepted rather than condemned. The future that had seemed so uncertain when she stepped off the stagecoach into the ruins of Millbrook Valley now glowed with promise and potential. Standing there in the darkness, one hand resting protectively over the child growing beneath her heart, Clara finally allowed herself to believe that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not just survival or acceptance, but the chance to build a life worthy of the dreams she had carried and the love she had to offer. The woman who had arrived in Millbrook Valley, broken and desperate, was disappearing, replaced by someone stronger and more confident. Someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim the happiness she deserved. Someone ready to embrace whatever challenges and joys the future might bring. November arrived with an early snowfall that blanketed Millbrook Valley in pristine white, transforming the rebuilding town into something that resembled a winter wonderland from a children's storybook. Clara stood at the clinic window, watching fat flakes drift past the glass, her hands resting on the pronounced curve of her belly where the baby had grown increasingly active in recent weeks. At 7 months along, she moved with the careful grace of advanced pregnancy, her body adapting to its changing requirements while her mind remained sharp and focused on the medical work that had become central to her identity. Dr. Hartwell emerged from the back room where she had been examining Mrs. Henderson's newborn son, her face glowing with the satisfaction that always followed a successful delivery. "Perfect health," she announced to Clara, who had assisted with the birth 3 days earlier. Strong lungs, good reflexes, and nursing well. I think we can safely say that young Master Henderson is thriving. Clara felt a familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with apprehension as she contemplated her own approaching delivery. Dr. Hartwell had pronounced her pregnancy progressing normally, but the reality of bringing a child into the world without a husband or family support remained daunting despite the community's growing acceptance of her situation. "Have you given more thought to your own delivery plans?" Dr. Hartwell asked gently, as though reading Clara's mind. "January is approaching faster than we might like, and winter births require additional preparation in a place like this." The practical concerns were significant. The shelter, while adequate for her current needs, was hardly ideal for childbirth and the recovery period that would follow. Clara had been saving every penny from her medical work, but her earnings were still modest compared to the costs of establishing independent housing before the baby arrived. "I've been looking at the boarding options in town," Clara replied, though her tone suggested limited enthusiasm for the available choices. "Mrs. Crawford has a room available above the general store, but it's quite expensive and rather isolated. From medical assistance if complications arise." Dr. Hartwell nodded thoughtfully, clearly considering various alternatives. Before she could respond, the clinic door opened and James entered, stamping snow from his boots and removing his hat to reveal hair darkened with moisture from the storm. His presence immediately brightened the room in ways that had nothing to do with the lamp he carried, and Clara felt her pulse quicken with the familiar joy that accompanied his appearances. "Ladies," he greeted them with the formal courtesy that he maintained in public settings, though his eyes lingered on Clara with warmth that spoke of deeper intimacy. "I wanted to check that the clinic's heating system is managing adequately in this weather." The temperature dropped significantly during the night. "We're quite comfortable, thank you," Dr. Hartwell replied, though Clara noticed the physician studying James with the speculative expression she wore when formulating treatment plans. "Actually, your timing is fortuitous. Clara and I were just discussing her housing situation as her delivery date approaches." James's attention immediately sharpened, focusing on Clara with concern that was both professional and deeply personal. "Is there a problem with the shelter arrangements?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at having her private circumstances discussed so openly, but she recognized that practical considerations needed to supersede personal embarrassment. "The shelter serves its purpose well, but it's not ideal for childbirth or caring for a newborn. I've been exploring alternatives." "What sort of alternatives?" James asked, his tone carefully neutral, though Clara could detect underlying tension in his voice. "Doctor." Hartwell stepped smoothly into the conversation with the authority of medical expertise. "Ideally, Clara should be in quarters that provide privacy, easy access to medical assistance, and adequate space for both mother and child during the initial recovery period. The boarding rooms available in town don't really meet those requirements." James was quiet for several moments, and Clara could almost see his mind working through various possibilities and their implications. When he spoke again, his words were chosen with obvious care. "There is another option that might address all of those concerns," he said slowly, his gaze moving between Clara and Dr. Hartwell. "I've been working on completing a house on the north side of town, originally intended for the fire station superintendent and his family. It has separate quarters that could provide complete privacy while remaining close enough to town for easy medical access." Clara's heart began to beat faster as she sensed the direction of his suggestion. Though she tried to maintain composure in front of Dr. Hartwell, the offer of housing was generous beyond anything she could have hoped for. But it also carried implications that would need to be carefully considered. "That's very thoughtful," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to accept such generous assistance without being able to provide appropriate compensation." James's expression grew slightly frustrated, as though he were struggling with the constraints of public propriety. We could discuss the details privately, but I'm certain we could arrange something mutually beneficial." Dr. Hartwell looked between them with growing understanding and what appeared to be approval. "I think that's an excellent suggestion. Proper housing during this critical period isn't just a convenience, it's a medical necessity. Clara, I would strongly recommend considering any arrangement that provides appropriate accommodations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Tommy Pike, who burst through the clinic door with the urgent energy of someone carrying important news. Snow clung to his coat and hat, suggesting he had run through the storm to reach them. "Captain Brennan, sir," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "There's been another accident at the northern construction site. Mr. Jenkins fell through some weakened flooring and landed hard on the rocks below. The foreman sent me to fetch Dr. Hartwell and anyone else who might be able to help." Dr. Hartwell was already reaching for her medical bag, her movements swift and efficient. "How serious are the injuries, Tommy?" "Conscious but inconsiderable. Pain," the young man reported. "Possible broken ribs and definitely something wrong with his shoulder. The arms hanging at an odd angle." Clara felt the familiar surge of purpose that accompanied medical emergencies, her mind immediately cataloging the supplies and procedures that might be required for such injuries. But Dr. Hartwell's next words brought her up short. "I'll need to handle this alone," the physician said firmly, noting Clara's obvious intention to assist. "The site is treacherous in good weather, and with snow and ice it would be dangerous for someone in your condition to attempt the journey." The restriction stung, though Clara recognized its medical necessity. Her advanced pregnancy did indeed make such travel risky, both for herself and for the baby. But watching Dr. Hartwell prepare to face a serious emergency without assistance felt like abandoning her professional responsibilities. James seemed to understand her frustration immediately. "I'll accompany Dr. Hartwell and assist with any heavy lifting or transportation that might be required," he offered. "My engineering background includes some medical training for construction emergencies." Dr. Hartwell nodded gratefully. "That would be extremely helpful. Clara, I'll need you to prepare the clinic for our return. Set up for potential surgery, organize the trauma supplies, and have everything ready for whatever treatment might be required." As the rescue party prepared to depart, James paused beside Clara, his expression conveying both concern for her, disappointment, and determination to handle the emergency competently. "We'll be back as soon as possible," he said quietly. "Try not to worry about things you can't control." The advice was sound but difficult to follow. As Clara watched them disappear into the swirling snow, she found herself pacing the clinic. With nervous energy, her hands moving automatically to organize and reorganize the medical supplies while her mind churned with anxiety about the emergency and frustration at her enforced inactivity. The afternoon stretched endlessly as she waited for news from the construction site. She prepared the surgery area with meticulous care, arranged every possible instrument and medication that might be needed, and checked the clinic's heating and lighting systems repeatedly to ensure optimal conditions for emergency treatment. It was nearly evening when she heard the sound of the rescue wagon returning, its wheels crunching through the snow-covered streets with deliberate slowness. That suggested careful attention to an injured passenger. Clara positioned herself at the clinic door, ready to assist with whatever medical needs awaited. Dr. Hartwell's face was grim with exhaustion and concern as she helped supervise the careful transfer of Mr. Jenkins from the wagon to the clinic's examination table. The injured man was conscious but clearly in significant pain, his face pale and drawn with the strain of enduring several hours of discomfort during the difficult journey back to town. Separated shoulder and 3 broken ribs, Dr. Hartwell reported tersely as Clara moved immediately to assist with patient care. "Possible internal injuries that won't be clear until we can complete a thorough examination. He's been remarkably stoic, but the pain is beginning to take its toll." Clara's training took over completely as she helped settle Mr. Jenkins on the examination table and began the systematic assessment of his injuries. The shoulder dislocation was obvious and would require careful manipulation to relocate properly. The broken ribs were more concerning, particularly given the possibility of internal damage from the force of his fall. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mr. Jenkins managed to say through gritted teeth as she examined his injured shoulder, "I hear you've become quite the medical expert since arriving in our town." "Dr. Hartwell has been an excellent teacher," Clara replied, her hands moving gently but thoroughly over the injured area to assess the extent of damage. "We're going to take good care of you, Mr. Jenkins. This shoulder will need to be relocated, which will be uncomfortable but should provide immediate relief from the worst of the pain." James had remained to assist with the patient transport, and Clara found his presence both comforting and professionally valuable. His engineering knowledge translated surprisingly well to understanding the mechanics of bone and joint injuries, and his steady hands provided exactly the kind of assistance Dr. Hartwell needed for the delicate process of relocating the dislocated shoulder. "On my count," Dr. Hartwell instructed, positioning herself to guide the shoulder joint back into proper alignment while James helped stabilize Mr. Jenkins's position. 1, 2, 3. The relocation procedure went smoothly, with the satisfying pop of the joint returning to its proper position followed immediately by visible relief on Mr. Jenkins's face. The broken ribs would require more time and careful monitoring to heal properly, but the immediate crisis had passed successfully. As they worked together to secure Mr. Jenkins's injuries with proper bandaging and splinting, Clara found herself once again impressed by the natural teamwork that seemed to emerge between herself, Dr. Hartwell, and James. Each seemed to anticipate the other's needs, creating an efficient and effective medical team despite their varied backgrounds and training. "Excellent work, all of you," Mr. Jenkins said weakly but sincerely as the treatment concluded. "I was afraid I might lose the use of that arm permanently, but it already feels significantly better." Dr. Hartwell smiled with the satisfaction that always followed successful treatment of serious injuries. "You'll need to keep that arm immobilized for several weeks and be very careful with those ribs, but there's no reason you shouldn't make a complete recovery." As Mr. Jenkins was settled comfortably for observation and rest, James helped Clara clean and reorganize the medical instruments they had used. The work provided an opportunity for quiet conversation away from the direct attention of others. "You handled that beautifully," James said softly, his admiration evident in his voice. "Watching you work, seeing your competence and composure under pressure, it's remarkable how much you've grown since arriving here." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise, though she tried to maintain professional modesty. "I had excellent teachers and assistants. This kind of emergency care requires teamwork. It requires skill and dedication, which you clearly possess," James replied firmly. "Clara, watching you today made me even more certain about something I've been wanting to discuss with you." The serious tone in his voice made Clara's pulse quicken with anticipation mixed with apprehension. She sensed that whatever James wanted to discuss would be significant, possibly life-changing in its implications. "What's that?" she asked quietly, setting down the instruments she had been cleaning. James moved closer, close enough that she could see the intensity in his gray eyes and the careful way he was choosing his words. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding housing arrangements for your delivery, and about our discussions of building a future together, and about the practical realities of your situation as your due date approaches." Clara's heart began to race as she sensed the direction of his thoughts, though she tried to maintain calm attention to his words. "I think it would be beneficial for everyone concerned if we were to formalize our relationship before the baby arrives," James continued carefully. "Not just for practical reasons, though those are significant, but because I've come to realize that I want to be your husband and a father to your child in every way that matters." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and promise and the potential to transform both their lives completely. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes as she processed what he was offering, not just marriage but genuine partnership and family. "James," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me," he replied, reaching for her hands with infinite gentleness. "To let me provide for you and your child, to share whatever challenges and joys lie ahead, to create the kind of family that neither of us thought we'd have the chance to experience again." The simple honesty of his proposal, free of flowery romantic language but rich with genuine commitment, moved Clara more deeply than any elaborate declaration could have. This was not a man offering convenient rescue to a woman in desperate circumstances, but a mature adult proposing genuine partnership based on mutual respect and affection. "I would be honored to marry you," Clara said softly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "More honored than I can possibly express." James's face transformed with joy, the shadows of grief and loss that she had grown accustomed to seeing there replaced by something bright and hopeful. Slowly, with infinite care for her condition, he drew her into his arms and held her gently against his chest. "I love you, Clara Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I love your strength, your compassion, your determination to build something meaningful from difficult circumstances. I love the way you care for people, the way you've made yourself essential to this community, the way you've brought purpose and hope back into my life." "I love you too," Clara replied, allowing herself to fully embrace the joy of the moment. "I love your kindness, your integrity, your commitment to protecting and serving others. I love the way you've made me feel valued and cherished when I thought such things were lost to me forever." Their moment of private celebration was gently interrupted by Dr. Hartwell's return to the main clinic area, though the physician's expression suggested she had deliberately given them time alone for their conversation. Her face lit with genuine delight as she took in their obvious happiness. "I take it congratulations are in order?" she asked warmly. "Dr. Hartwell," James said formally, though his arm remained protectively around Clara's waist, "I've asked Mrs. Whitmore to marry me, and she has done me the honor of accepting. We hoped you might agree to serve as witness to the ceremony." "I would be delighted," Dr. Hartwell replied immediately. "When are you planning the wedding?" Clara and James exchanged glances, both clearly realizing that they hadn't discussed the practical timeline for their marriage. Given Clara's advanced pregnancy and the approaching winter weather, timing would be crucial. "As soon as possible," James said decisively. "There's no benefit to waiting, and several significant advantages to formalizing our union before the baby arrives." Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. "I think that's very wise. Pastor Fairfax could perform the ceremony this Sunday if you'd like. A church wedding, or he could officiate privately if you prefer something more intimate." The prospect of a church wedding, with the entire community as witnesses to their union, was both thrilling and somewhat overwhelming to Clara. She had dreamed of such ceremonies as a young woman, but her circumstances had long since taught her to expect more modest arrangements. "What would you prefer?" James asked, clearly wanting her wishes to take precedence in the decision. Clara considered the options carefully. A public ceremony would mark their marriage as a celebration embraced by the entire community, but it would also subject her to scrutiny and potential judgment about the timing of their union relative to her pregnancy. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would prefer something intimate but official. Perhaps in the church, but with only close friends as witnesses." "Perfect," James agreed immediately. Dr. Hartwell, Pastor Fairfax, and perhaps Tommy Pike, to represent the younger generation of the community. "Anyone else you'd particularly like to include?" The question made Clara realize how much her social circle had expanded since arriving in Millbrook Valley. Several people had shown her genuine kindness and support, creating the kind of community connections she had never experienced in Hartford. Mrs. Henderson, perhaps, since she's been so helpful with preparing baby clothes and supplies. And if you think it appropriate, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Despite everything that happened with Theodore, I bear them no ill will. James's expression suggested deep respect for her generous spirit. Your forgiveness and grace continue to amaze me, he said softly. Yes, I think including them would be a beautiful gesture of community healing. As they made plans for their wedding ceremony, Clara felt a sense of completeness settling over her that she had never experienced before. In just a few days, she would become Mrs. James Brennan, wife to a man who loved and valued her, stepmother to the memory of children who would always hold a place in his heart, and soon to be the mother of a child who would be welcomed and cherished rather than merely tolerated. The transformation from desperate mail-order bride to respected community member, skilled medical assistant, and beloved wife seemed almost too wonderful to believe. But as James discussed arrangements for moving her belongings to their new home, and Dr. Hartwell planned the medical preparations for a winter delivery, Clara allowed herself to embrace the reality of her changed circumstances. She had found what she had been searching for all along, not just safety and acceptance, but genuine love and the chance to build a meaningful life, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. The baby growing beneath her heart would be born into a family filled with love and hope, in a community that would welcome another child as a blessing rather than a burden. Standing there in the clinic where she had discovered her calling and her strength, surrounded by people who had become her chosen family, Clara finally understood that sometimes the most devastating rejections could lead to the most beautiful new beginnings. Theodore Mansfield's cruel dismissal had hurt terribly at the time, but it had also freed her to find something infinitely better than what she had originally sought. Tomorrow would bring the practical details of wedding preparations and household arrangements. But tonight, as she accepted congratulations from Mr. Jenkins and helped Dr. Hartwell close the clinic for the evening, Clara allowed herself to simply bask in the joy of being chosen and cherished by a man whose love would provide the foundation for whatever challenges and celebrations lay ahead. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with fresh snow sparkling like diamonds in the mountain sunlight. Clara stood before the small mirror in Bee's private quarters, carefully arranging her hair while the older woman bustled around making final adjustments to the cream-colored dress they had altered specifically for the occasion. The gown, originally one of Clara's traveling dresses, had been transformed with delicate lace borrowed from Dr. Hartwell and pearl buttons, contributed by Mrs. Henderson, into something truly beautiful and appropriate for a bride. You look radiant, my dear, Bee said warmly, stepping back to admire their handiwork. Pregnancy has given you such a lovely glow, and happiness has done the rest. James Brennan is a fortunate man indeed. Clara touched her belly gently, feeling the baby's active movements beneath the soft fabric of her dress. At 8 months along, her condition was unmistakably obvious, but she no longer felt shame about it. Instead, she felt blessed to be bringing new life into a world where that life would be welcomed and cherished from its very first breath. The small wedding party gathered in the church vestibule as Pastor Fairfax made final preparations for the ceremony. Dr. Hartwell wore her finest dark blue dress and carried a small bouquet of winter greenery that she had gathered from the surrounding forest. Tommy Pike had polished his boots until they gleamed and slicked his hair back with what appeared to be an entire jar of pomade. The Petersons arrived with their 3 children, scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best, their faces reflecting genuine happiness for Clara's good fortune. Most remarkably, Theodore appeared in the vestibule just as the ceremony was about to begin, his hat in his hands and his expression carrying the mixture of nervousness and determination. Clara felt James tense beside her, clearly uncertain about Theodore's intentions and prepared to remove him if necessary. Mrs. Whitmore, Theodore said quietly, his voice carrying none of the arrogance or cruelty that had marked their previous encounters. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony begins." Clara exchanged glances with James, who nodded slightly to indicate his willingness to allow the conversation, provided she was comfortable with it. The public nature of the setting and the presence of their supporters made her feel safe enough to hear whatever Theodore wished to say. "What is it, Mr. Mansfield?" she asked calmly. Theodore took a deep breath, clearly struggling with words. That didn't come easily to his nature. "I wanted to apologize publicly for my treatment of you when you first arrived in Millbrook Valley. My behavior was inexcusable, and I've come to understand that I was wrong about your character and your worth to this community." The apology was unexpected and clearly difficult for him to deliver, but Clara recognized the sincerity behind it. Theodore had never been evil, merely weak and concerned with appearances above substance. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes publicly suggested genuine remorse. "Your situation forced me to examine my own values and priorities," Theodore continued, his gaze moving briefly to James before returning to Clara. "Watching how you've conducted yourself since arriving here, seeing the respect you've earned through your own merit, it's made me realize that I was the one lacking in character, not you." Clara felt an unexpected surge of compassion for the man who had caused her such pain. His apology couldn't undo the hurt he had inflicted, but it did represent the kind of growth and accountability that could contribute to community healing. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Mansfield," she replied graciously. "I hold no ill will toward you or your family. We've all learned valuable lessons from the experiences we've shared." Theodore nodded gratefully, then turned to James with obvious respect. "Captain Brennan, you're getting a remarkable woman. I hope you'll both be very happy together." James accepted the gesture with the dignity that characterized all his interactions, though Clara could see the protective tension that remained in his posture. "Thank you, Theodore. Your presence here means a great deal to Clara, and I appreciate your willingness to set aside past difficulties." As Theodore took his place among the small gathering of witnesses, Pastor Fairfax called the wedding party to order. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful, with vows that Clara and James had written themselves reflecting their mature understanding of love, commitment, and the challenges they would face together. "James," Clara said, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion welling in her chest, "I promise to stand beside you through whatever joys and sorrows life may bring. I promise to be your partner in building a home filled with love, purpose, and hope. I promise to honor the memory of those you've lost while embracing the future we'll create together." James's vows were equally heartfelt and specific to their circumstances. "Clara, I promise to love and protect both you and your child as my own family. I promise to support your dreams and ambitions, to value your contributions to our community, and to never take for granted the second chance at happiness you've given me. I promise to be the husband and father that you both deserve." When Pastor Fairfax pronounced them husband and wife, James's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of the tenderness and respect that would characterize their marriage. The small congregation erupted in applause and congratulations, with even little Tommy Pike cheering enthusiastically from his position near the front pew. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful, with the entire wedding party gathering at B's shelter for a meal of roasted chicken, winter vegetables, and a cake that Mrs. Henderson had somehow managed to create despite the limited ingredients available in their frontier community. Clara found herself overwhelmed by the warmth and genuine affection of the people surrounding her, a stark contrast to the cold judgment she had expected when first arriving in Millbrook Valley. Dr. Hartwell raised a toast with cups of cider, her usually reserved demeanor giving way to obvious emotion. "To Clara and James, two people who have shown us all that love can emerge from loss, that strength can be found in vulnerability, and that the best families are often the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into. As the afternoon progressed and the celebration continued, Clara felt a deep sense of completion settling over her. She was no longer Clara Whitmore, the desperate woman who had fled Connecticut in shame and fear. She was Clara Brennan, wife to a man who cherished her, member of a community that valued her contributions, and soon to be mother to a child who would grow up surrounded by love and acceptance. The transition to their new home that evening was both practical and symbolic. James had spent weeks preparing the house for her arrival, ensuring that every detail was arranged for her comfort and the baby's imminent needs. The nursery he had created was a masterpiece of loving preparation, with a handcrafted crib, carefully hung curtains, and shelves lined with baby clothes that various community members had contributed. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the crib that James had obviously crafted himself. "You've thought of everything." "I want our child to feel welcomed from the very first moment," James replied, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind and resting his hands on her prominent belly. "This baby will never doubt that it's wanted and loved." The pronoun he used, "our child" rather than "your child," brought tears to Clara's eyes. In the space of a few months, her baby had gone from being a source of shame and burden to being the cherished center of a loving family. The transformation seemed almost miraculous in its completeness. Their first weeks of marriage settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. James continued his work supervising the town's reconstruction, while Clara maintained her medical training with Dr. Hartwell, though her activities became necessarily more limited as her pregnancy advanced. They spent their evenings reading together, discussing plans for the spring planting season and preparing for the arrival of their child. The baby chose to make its appearance on a bitter January night, when the wind howled around their sturdy house and snow piled against the windows in deep drifts. Clara woke to the familiar tightening of labor pains just after midnight, though she initially tried to convince herself that this was merely another bout of the false labor that had been troubling her for weeks. "James," she said quietly, shaking his shoulder gently as the contractions became unmistakably regular and strong, "I think it's time." James was instantly alert, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared thoroughly for this moment. He helped Clara into the robe they had laid ready, built up the fire in both the bedroom and the kitchen, and sent Tommy Pike racing through the storm to fetch Dr. Hartwell. The labor progressed steadily through the early morning hours, with Dr. Hartwell arriving just as the contractions became intense enough to require Clara's complete attention. James proved to be an invaluable assistant, providing emotional support and practical help with a composure that impressed even the experienced physician. "You're doing beautifully," Dr. Hartwell encouraged, as Clara worked through the demanding process of bringing new life into the world. "Everything is proceeding exactly as it should." James never left Clara's side, holding her hand through the difficult contractions and offering words of encouragement that helped her maintain focus and determination. His presence made the entire experience feel safer and more manageable than she had ever imagined possible. When their daughter finally arrived, just as the winter dawn was breaking over the mountains, she announced her presence with lusty cries that filled the house with the sound of vibrant, new life. Dr. Hartwell placed the baby on Clara's chest, while James looked down at both of them with an expression of wonder and love so profound that Clara felt her heart overflow with happiness. "She's perfect," James whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Absolutely perfect." Clara gazed down at her daughter, taking in the delicate features and the shock of dark hair that was already beginning to curl slightly. The baby's eyes, when they briefly opened, were the clear gray blue of newborns, but Clara thought she could see hints of the intelligence and determination that would shape this child's character in years to come. "What shall we name her?" James asked softly, clearly understanding that the choice was Clara's to make. Clara had been considering names for months, but looking down at her daughter now, only one seemed right. Hope, she said firmly. Hope Brennan. Because she represents everything hopeful and new about our future together. James smiled, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Hope Brennan. It's perfect. Dr. Hartwell completed her examination of both mother and baby with obvious satisfaction. Both of you are in excellent health, she announced. Hope is a good size for a winter baby. Her breathing is strong, and she's already showing signs of wanting to nurse. Clara, your recovery should be straightforward provided you get adequate rest and nutrition. As word of Hope's arrival spread through the community, a steady stream of visitors began appearing at their door despite the challenging weather. Bee arrived with fresh bread and hearty soup. Mrs. Henderson brought warm blankets and practical baby clothes. And even the Petersons stopped by with congratulations and small gifts for the new family. Theodore's visit was perhaps the most meaningful, though it was brief and obviously difficult for him. He stood awkwardly in their front room, hat in hand, clearly struggling with emotions he wasn't accustomed to expressing. Mrs. Brennan, he said formally, then corrected himself. Clara, I wanted to congratulate you on your daughter's birth, and to say that I'm grateful you've chosen to make Millbrook Valley your permanent home. He paused, gathering his courage for something that was clearly important to him. I've been thinking a great deal about the choices I made when you first arrived here, and about the kind of man I want to be as this community continues to grow. Your example, your grace in the face of my poor treatment, it's challenged me to become better than I was. Clara, holding Hope in her arms while James stood protectively beside them, felt moved by Theodore's obvious sincerity. We all have opportunities to grow and change, Mr. Mansfield. What matters is that we take advantage of those opportunities when they arise. I hope my children will grow up to be more like you and less like I was when you first knew me, Theodore said quietly. This community is fortunate to have you both. After he left, James shook his head in amazement. I never thought I'd see Theodore Mansfield humble himself to anyone, least of all to acknowledge his own failings. You've had quite an impact on this entire community, Mrs. Brennan. Clara smiled at the sound of her new name, still getting accustomed to the reality of being Mrs. Brennan. I think we've all had an impact on each other. That's what real communities do. They help everyone involved become better versions of themselves. The weeks that followed Hope's birth were a golden time of adjustment and discovery. Clara marveled at how naturally James took to fatherhood, despite having no previous experience with infants. He proved to be patient during the long nights when Hope needed feeding and comforting, helpful with the endless practical demands of caring for a newborn, and endlessly fascinated by every small development in their daughter's growth. She smiled at me, he announced one morning with the excitement of someone who had witnessed a miracle. I'm certain it was a real smile, not just gas. Clara looked over at their daughter, now 6 weeks old and beginning to show more awareness of her surroundings. Hope was indeed looking at James with what appeared to be recognition and pleasure, her tiny face animated in ways that suggested genuine social interaction. She knows her father, Clara said warmly, watching the interaction between James and Hope with deep contentment. She feels safe and loved with you. The observation seemed to move James profoundly. He reached for Clara's hand, holding it tightly while continuing to gaze down at their daughter. I never thought I'd have this again, he said quietly. A family, children who look to me for protection and guidance, the sense of purpose that comes from being needed and loved. Clara squeezed his hand gently. Hope and I need you very much. Not just for protection and provision, but for the love and wisdom you bring to everything you do. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt in the mountains around Millbrook Valley, Clara found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a desperate woman fleeing scandal and shame, carrying an unwanted pregnancy and facing an uncertain future. Now she was a respected member of a thriving community, a valued medical assistant well on her way to formal certification, a beloved wife, and the mother of a daughter who would grow up surrounded by love and opportunity. The transformation seemed almost too wonderful to believe, but it was grounded in choices she had made and strength she had discovered within herself. When Theodore Mansfield had rejected her so cruelly, she could have given up and returned east in defeat. Instead, she had chosen to stay and build a life based on her own worth rather than someone else's approval. When medical emergencies had tested her abilities, she could have deferred to others and remained in the background. Instead, she had embraced the challenges and developed skills that allowed her to contribute meaningfully to her community's welfare. When James had offered love and partnership, she could have been too afraid of further rejection to accept. Instead, she had chosen to trust in the possibility of happiness and opened her heart to the kind of love she had never dared to hope for. Dr. Hartwell stopped by one afternoon to check on Hope's development and to discuss Clara's plans for resuming her medical training. The physician found mother and daughter both thriving, with Hope growing rapidly and Clara recovering her strength and energy with remarkable speed. "I've been in correspondence with the medical college in Denver," Dr. Hartwell announced as they sat in Clara's comfortable front room watching Hope play with her toes. "They're establishing a new program for rural practitioners that would allow you to complete your certification through a combination of practical training and periodic intensive sessions." The possibility of formal medical credentials had seemed impossibly distant when Clara first arrived in Millbrook Valley, but now it felt achievable and appropriate. Her experience assisting with everything from routine examinations to emergency surgery had given her a solid foundation of practical knowledge, and her dedication to learning had impressed everyone who worked with her. What would that mean in terms of time commitment, travel requirements? Clara asked, thinking about the practical challenges of continuing her education while caring for Hope and maintaining her responsibilities to James and their household. The intensive sessions would require trips to Denver twice a year, lasting about 2 weeks each time, Dr. Hartwell explained. "The rest of the training could be completed here under my supervision, with written examinations and practical assessments conducted locally." James, who had been listening from the kitchen while preparing tea, joined the conversation with obvious enthusiasm. "Clara, this is exactly the opportunity you've been working toward. We'll make whatever arrangements are necessary to support your education." The ease with which he dismissed potential complications and focused on making her dreams possible was typical of the way James approached their partnership. He had never viewed her ambitions as competition with her domestic responsibilities, but rather as natural extensions of the person he had fallen in love with. "I think I'd like to pursue it," Clara said carefully, still somewhat amazed that such opportunities were available to her. "With the condition that it doesn't interfere with my responsibilities to Hope or to our family." "There's no reason it should," Dr. Hartwell assured her. "The program is specifically designed for people in circumstances like yours, practitioners, who are already serving their communities while working toward formal recognition of their skills." As summer arrived and Millbrook Valley continued its remarkable recovery from the devastating fire, Clara often found herself standing on her front porch in the evenings, holding Hope while watching James tend to their small garden. The scene represented everything she had dreamed of during her darkest moments: a peaceful home, a loving family, meaningful work, and a community where she was valued and accepted. The mail-order bride who had arrived broken and desperate had been transformed into a woman of substance and purpose. The pregnancy that had been a source of shame had become the blessing that brought the greatest joy to her life. The rejection that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something far better than she had ever imagined possible. One evening, as she and James sat on their porch watching Hope practice her attempts at crawling across a blanket spread on the grass, a letter arrived from Hartford that made Clara's transformation feel complete. The letter was from her former employer, Mrs. Richardson, who had heard through mutual acquaintances about Clara's new circumstances. My dear Clara, the letter read, I have heard the most remarkable reports about your new life in Montana Territory. It seems you have established yourself as both a medical practitioner and a respected member of your community, in addition to marrying well and becoming a mother. I confess I am quite amazed by these developments, having always thought of you as rather retiring and conventional. Perhaps the frontier brings out qualities in people that more civilized settings suppress. I do hope you are truly happy in your new circumstances. Clara handed the letter to James with a smile that held both amusement and satisfaction. The woman who had once employed her as a seamstress could barely comprehend the person Clara had become, viewing her transformation as somehow miraculous, rather than the natural result of being allowed to develop her full potential. She seems surprised that you're capable of such accomplishments, James observed after reading the letter. I suspect she never really saw you clearly when you lived in Hartford. Very few people did, Clara agreed, including myself most of the time. I don't think I understood what I was capable of until I was forced to discover it. James reached over to take her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally as they watched Hope's determined efforts to reach a toy that had been placed just beyond her grasp. Sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances, he said thoughtfully. If Theodore hadn't rejected you, if the fire hadn't destroyed the original town, if you hadn't been forced to start over completely, we might never have found each other. Clara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Every painful experience, every moment of despair and uncertainty, had been necessary to bring her to this place of contentment and purpose. The woman she was now could never have been shaped by an easy life or conventional choices. I'm grateful for all of it, she said softly, watching Hope finally succeed in grasping her toy and examining it with the intense concentration that babies brought to new discoveries. Even the pain and rejection, because they led me here to you, to this life we've built together. As the sun set behind the mountains and they prepared to carry Hope inside for her evening feeding, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her home. She had traveled 1,000 miles and endured devastating rejection to find the love and belonging she had been seeking all along. But more than that, she had discovered her own strength, her own worth, and her own capacity for building a meaningful life from whatever materials were available. The mail-order bride who had been rejected for being already pregnant had become a woman who understood that sometimes the very things that make us seem unacceptable to small minds are actually the sources of our greatest strength. Her pregnancy had brought her hope, her desperation had led her to James, and her willingness to start over had allowed her to become the person she was truly meant to be. Standing in the doorway of her home, surrounded by love and possibility, Clara Brennan finally understood that the best dreams are often the ones we never dare to dream, and the greatest gifts are sometimes wrapped in the most challenging circumstances. She had found her place in the world, not by conforming to someone else's expectations, but by having the courage to be exactly who she was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.